Now we're really good to go.
Nice.
That would have been embarrassing. All right. So let's start with who I am. So my name is Stephen Russett. I work for a company called OpenPlus.ca, and we're from Ottawa, Canada primarily. We work across Canada. And originally, before I worked with OpenPlus, I worked with the City of Ottawa. And I worked mainly with a program called the Service Ottawa program, which was an $80 million program over 4 years to completely analyze and touch on every aspect of citizen-facing services across the organization. And if you ever think about a municipality, it is the most, has the most touch points in your daily life, bar none with any other type of agency. So the second that you wake up in the morning, the power, your water, by the time you walk out, if there's a pothole or if the street lights aren't working, if a sign is missing, whatever it may be, we looked at all of those services and we looked at transforming those services. One of those came into being the web, and we did implement Drupal as their primary service provider for all aspects of online services, all aspects of the web interface, and this went into not only the web, but we also looked at how could this be leveraged from an internet perspective. One of the biggest tasks that we went through was an analysis of business processes. And when we looked at web business processes, a common issue wasn't about how do I meet accessibility. We all know we follow WCAG AA compliance, and in Canada, the standards are very similar to the 508. They all come back to WCAG 2.0 AA compliance that are being met, eventually AAA compliance, but that's many years away. The issue was more about how do we implement accessibility, maintain it without pulling out our hair? How do we make sure that our staff know how to do accessible content and keep that content accessible, even with staff changeover, even with the continuing complexity of content? And it was really looking at how do we innovate those business practices? What sort of information can we store? And the typical practice is let's create an accessibility training program, and everyone's going to learn that, and they're going to keep the 60-page PDF by them, and somehow they're going to know what that is. So this presentation is really going to focus on how do you innovate your business practice to make sure that you can maintain accessibility. We all know how to do accessibility content. It's part of WCAG. It's just a tedious process by the time you go through it. So, as I said, goals. We really want to track, or we really want to know how to track accessibility. How do we maintain accessibility? So a common practice with any website that's being deployed for the first time is they show these nice pretty pictures with content. They go through this practice of, yes, we've made sure the site is 100% accessible. But then on day 2, when content changes, how do you deal with that? Who's going to ensure that it's kept up to date? I'm going to be touching on leveraging the Web Experience Toolkit Drupal distribution and leveraging the JavaScript library, which is the Web Experience Toolkit, which is what the distribution is based off of. So let's jump right into that. So the WET distribution, which is found at project/wetkit, and for anyone that was at yesterday's presentation, the 2x branch has now been released as a dev as of yesterday, so that's online now. Anyone can download. And I'll be showing just a quick demo of that. So this was a Canadian-led distribution. There is no single owner of it. It is used by government agencies, departments, and in Canada, every agency must have the same look and feel. They must not have the same CMS, but they have to have the core look and feel. And you will notice every Canadian government website that falls within this charter has the exact same look and feel. There's a new look and feel that was just implemented. So if you were to go to canada.ca, that is the brand new look and feel. It's fully responsive. It uses Bootstrap. It has all the latest and greatest technologies. That runs solely actually as a Node website. And the more and more systems with the 2x branch that just came out, that also runs Bootstrap now for the Drupal distribution. So the main goals for government in Canada have always been around multilingualism, so primarily English and French, fully accessible, front end and back end, integration with the WET.js library, which is a mandate for the federal government. As I said, everyone must use this library. And it has to be a turnkey option, because implementing the JS libraries was the issue with every CMS. Is how do you implement this? Even with Drupal, we see this with how do you implement Bootstrap? It's not just you add it to the theme. There's all sorts of components with a CMS of how do you implement that. Do I implement it with views? Do I implement it with content types? What about on the Node landing pages? What about it with Panelizer and panelized styles? How do you deal with that on a day-to-day basis? The wet.js library is primarily based off of jQuery and Bootstrap, and it's designed to be the foundation and the building blocks to build accessible and multilingual websites. It's fully responsive out of the box. They have code fests, working groups, and everything that gets put into the web accessibility toolkit fully goes through user testing, acceptance testing. There's a full team of staff that work on this for the entire government that's dedicated to this program. It's not going anywhere. They're already in version 4. Version 4 came out in January, and they're already working on version 4.1 and 4.2. So there's incremental development. The JS library can be used by anyone. You don't need Drupal. You could implement it in your own static website. And let's just jump to an example here. There we go. Okay, so this is the Web Experience Toolkit distribution. I'm logged in as content dev in the environment. One feature with the distribution is turnkey deployment, which is a common issue for all government agencies. How do I get from my potentially development environment or content staging right to production? We've backported and leveraged the deploy module as well as the web services module to make the connection between the two. So on this system, I'm literally able to go content, add content, deploy, which is just a content type that has a special field called deploy this content. And if I call this sample Steven 123, and I paste some content in, and I'm just going to select the language, and I'm going to publish it. And if I press save, you will see that it's about to say this has been syndicated to the destination website. And if I was to go to prod 3, there's my content that was just added. The rule of thumb with this is that nothing on your production server should be have any revisions, moderation. It should only be your public content. We've set it up so that any entity is deployable, including users and files. So the distribution uses fully file entities across the board. The 2x branch looks like so the 2x branch, which I said is Bootstrap based, again leverages D8 components that get backported over. So I'll leave it at that. You're welcome to download it at, yes, it leverages components from D8. So for example, the admin menu, which we've all seen. You may have seen it like this. So that's all components. All right, so let's jump back into the presentation. So part of the wet library, out of the box, just JS, you get archived content, charts and graphs, data Ajax, Lightbox, MathML, tabbed interfaces, your typical sliders, session timeouts, form validations, footnotes, overlays, multimedia players, including audio, video, and YouTube, transitions, Twitter embeds, all the text highlighting, all the typical functions that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. All of these have fallbacks for older browsers. They're all multilingual. They're all accessible. It's all available on GitHub, fully documented. They're always looking for improvements. Please join in whenever you can. So common problems we deal with accessibility is frame versus content. So on a typical project, there's your frame of your website, so not any specific content that goes into it. And then there's your content perspective, which is not only the body field, but we could call it the interpretive perception of where things are, the exact colors that are used. Ongoing content creation, as I mentioned before, we have to deal with this. How do we make sure that we always have our content that's up to date, maintaining that accessibility? And then we have to train content producers and editors to make sure that they understand how to make accessible content. And as we have turnover, it's a constant problem. Again, we go back to the 60+ page training programs. I've seen everything from formalized half-day to full-day accessibility training courses that people take once, and then they're supposed to remember that forever. And they may only work in the system for 1 day a week, if that, maybe sometimes 1 day a month. And when they do their training, it's like, well, they do it on the 1st of the month, but they never actually touch the system to the 31st, yet they were supposed to remember all those steps. It doesn't happen. They end up calling, or they end up making a mistake, and they have to get their content up, and accessibility becomes a secondary thought. PDF accessibility is a big one, especially for governments. We love to create PDFs, and we pump those out, whether they be of maps or text or stylized documents. We're starting to get away from that more and more with HTML5, but communications departments love to pump out stylized PDFs, which are never accessible, whether they create them in Illustrator, Photoshop, whatever it may be. Dealing with alt tags and title tags or alt attributes and title attributes on images, the issue is still there around not how do you implement them, it's about what's the content that goes into them. And from an audio-video accessibility perspective, it's not so much making sure that the video player is accessible, it's making sure that you have the proper content. Do you have a transcript? Do you have closed captioning? What if it's live streaming? How do you deal with that? And then from a forms perspective, it really comes down to form validation. So yes, we can navigate the form if we follow the proper form structure, but when there's errors, how do we ensure that people understand what's going on? So if we jump into the frame perspective, the typical process that we see is you create a design, that design eventually gets approved and it gets built, and then they finally, at the end, they say, let's run an accessibility review to make sure everything's good and we'll make some adjustments. And then we review those, or we review the determined changes to figure out who makes the changes to the design. If it's content, it's not really a problem, you can hand that off. But when it's, you have an approved design for, let's say, a header and footer, and then all of a sudden it goes through an accessibility review where there's an interpretation, or it goes through some sort of usability testing where a select few users say it should be slightly different or it should be significantly different. Where does that time come from in a project? So going forward, if any of you are creating RFPs or SOWs with either contractors or even internal staff, depending on how you work, make sure you account for the interpretive content. Not just saying it must be accessible, because must be accessible becomes interpretive once you get beyond the standard WCAG accessibility requirements. You're really getting into the whole idea of who's fiscally responsible for making the changes once you have an approved design. Now, you could switch that process and say, let's do an accessibility review at the beginning, but that's not guaranteeing that near the end of the project, you're not going to have another accessibility review that takes into content, final usability testing. Typically, there's some sort of QA process that we go through. So really make sure that in your RFPs and in your SOWs, you make clear who's fiscally responsible for those changes. And in most cases, it's likely going to be iteration time that you'll put in. You'll say, we'll cover, as part of the budget, 5 iterations of accessibility changing. That'll be 4 hours worth of time each, whatever it may be. So let's jump to ongoing content creation. And we're going to talk about the Quail module, or in Drupal, we call it the accessibility module, which leverages Quail. And this is, how do we ensure that content that's being created is accessible? So this is all about the body field. So once we're in there, what we really want to do is create a curated experience. We're going to talk about this a bit more. But it's about the ability to run automated tests directly on your content within the WYSIWYG. And we see this in an example right here. So here's a piece of content where we have an image and we have a title. We have these green boxes that are highlighted over, and when we press the checkbox button and we select one of those, we can now get a message that says this. It says, accessibility, if an image is purely decorative, the alt text must be empty. This is the pattern that we go through. So this is part of the accessibility module, and it's being integrated as part of the 2x branch of the Web Experience Toolkit. It just becomes standard. This is an early beta. The latest versions are much more stylized and a little more user-friendly. This is your bare bones automation that you would want to implement. Your typical content editors are not going to remember every single accessibility standard that they have to go through. So rather than putting them through training courses once a year, curate the experience and bring the content to them. Run the automated tests as they produce their content and tell them what the problems are even before they go through the process. Abbreviations and acronyms is another example where we hit this issue. So governments love to use abbreviations and acronyms. How do we deal with that? Well, as part of a WYSIWYG, we have the ability to create abbreviations, and you can create automated tests that identify abbreviations. It's just a regex that gets run. So one, highlight abbreviations that are a problem. Make them part of essentially the spell check process that you go through. And when you create an abbreviation, we can now add the abbreviation in, and they can provide the explanation. So that when the user highlights over this, they get what the abbreviation stands for. More so, when a screen reader goes over this, it now has the abbreviation, so you're able to keep your content visually short. But for anyone that's using a screen reader or may not know what that abbreviation or acronym means, they have the full context of it. built in, ready to go. This is all part of the HTML5 spec. File types. So, as part of the Web Experience Toolkit distribution, we use everything is entity-based. Everything. Everything is fieldable and translatable. So that includes files. So files, we add fields to. It's not just you're uploading a file. You want to be able to track the accessibility of your files. PDFs is a great example of this. Images. It's not just what the image alt tag and title text is. It's what is the image? What is it going to be used for? Who's in the image? There may be a description. It's essentially document management and asset management, but at a basic scale. So PDFs is a perfect example of this. Is the PDF accessible? If anyone's dealt with large-scale deployments of your sites and you deal with, I may have 10,000 PDFs on my site, okay? How many are accessible will be the first question you'll get when you have to deal with accessibility. I'm not sure. So maybe you do a spot check and you determine 9,000 are accessible. So there's 1,000 that are not. Okay? What do we need to do to make the other 1,000 accessible? How long is it going to take? The next questions you're going to get is, well, what content's in that PDF? Because we need to write an RFP or put out an SOW that'll have basically specs to say, here's all our PDFs, and we want to make them accessible. We need to know a budget, typical government process that we go through. Well, if you don't track that information about how complex the documents are, how many pages are the documents, who owns the documents, I can't count the number of times that we get these large-scale deployments, and we look at them and we go, okay, this group of PDFs are not accessible. Who owns them? Who can we send them back to? No one knows, because it's not tracked anywhere. And someone somewhere has some sort of Excel file or copy on the shared drive or your S drive or your local file system, whatever it may be. But there's no reason why we can't integrate that right into the system. So we want to create a curated experience. And this is really about building file logic directly into your file entities. You ask questions about the assets, where you say things like, is this image decorative? What type of image is it? Is this a portrait, a map, a chart, a graph, a GIF? Is it animated? If it's a PDF, it's how many pages? Based on those questions, we know what to do. You wrote them in your accessibility training guides. So implement that information directly into the system. Somewhere along the way, we've gotten to the point where we said, hey, I have an accessibility issue. I'm just going to train people on it constantly rather than build those accessibility tests directly into the system. So that's what we try and leverage with the Web Experience Toolkit. And we'll see an example of this related to videos. So videos must have a poster image in case it needs a fallback, and it must have closed captioning. Well, those are actually fields that are built right into the system. For something like alt text, as we saw in this example here, it identifies that decorative images must have alt text that are essentially double quotes or an empty alt text tag. In a lot of cases, you don't even need to identify that to the user. If you follow a curated approach, then when we go through this process, you just ask the question right when you're embedding the information. Is this image decorative? If it's yes, you don't need to ask what the alt text is because they don't need to worry about it. It's done. If it's not decorative, then you can force them to provide alt text. And if you want to get fancy even going forward, you can put in sentiment analysis and text analysis for determining, example, if the alt text and title text are the same, then there's likely a problem. And so you can get fancy with all sorts of logic like that, but that's down the road. So we really want to guide that user through what to do. And as I said, you have that training course. So don't think that you're starting with nothing. You already have all the information you need to build it into the system. You really just need to hand it to the developers, or if you're self the developer, go grab a copy of that document and follow through the steps and add it directly into media. The typical, it's this one I want to focus on, and it's something that's lost very quickly, is that if you're not getting funding for this, really bring back to your management around, they realize that training it's just one function. And that accessibility, while it's a mandated approach, it's just one more function on top of every other job function that you have to deal with. So don't make it one more job function. Just make it not even a choice for them. Make it part of the system, and they don't have to worry about it. Here's an example on how we deal with image accessibility from image sizes. So using media module and using view modes and file entities, we're able to create view modes called, example in this case, WYSIWYG, small image, small padding, and then we have medium and large, and then we have small image, no padding, and medium and large. The use cases here is that when you float an image right, and that, let's say we're going down to 320 in your responsive site, and that image is only 320 or 300 pixels wide, or maybe 180 pixels wide, you then get stacking of text on the left-hand side of the screen, and you end up with like one word on top of each other. You want to get away from that as much as possible. Well, rather than training the user that images cannot be less than 320 pixels wide, just make it not even a decision. Make it a curated response. So the second that they pick their image, they get to see what all the image styles are. So there's a medium image, and there's a small image. From a padding perspective, that allows them to slide it right, but then also not have their text be pushed right up against the image. But we know that we built right into the CSS that that's all handled for you. So PDF and document accessibility, we take the same curated approach. All right? We want to track those assets, as I talked about. And it's not just PDFs. We have Word, Excel files, PPT, Flash, audio, video, all the same process. So again, we go through this curated approach to making sure that we add fields to files. And it looks like something like this. So this is an example where I've uploaded a PDF, and as part of the documentation for that PDF when they upload it, they need to provide a document description, they want to provide the page count, potentially who the owner is, who was the accessibility checked by, you may have the publication date, which could be different than the date created. So the date created, and a good example here is in Canada, as part of the Ontario accessibility standards, there's rules that say if the PDF is online but was created before a certain date, it doesn't need to be accessible. But the second you touch it, whether it's a typo, you add an image, you merge it with another PDF, it now must be made accessible. Well, again, if you're looking for funding or if you have to deal with this issue, someone's going to ask you the question and say, how many PDFs have been touched since that date, whatever it may be? And if you can't answer that, you're in a world of hurt. Because now you have to go through and you're going to have to create a whole inventory of what to do, and you're going to have to get people involved. Eliminate that. Curate the process and allow them to collect it. If we also collect things like document complexity and document contents, when it comes time to making documents accessible, maybe you have a budget of $10,000 a year for accessibility from transferring old content into accessible content. It'd be nice to be able to create an inventory that, again, you can build right through views, because it's just an entity, so it's fully views accessible, to say, I'm going to tackle all the low complexity content first that is primarily only text content, versus if I have to deal with high complexity CAD documents or architectural drawings or 3D images, making those accessible or making an accessible equivalent is much more costly and much more difficult to do. Here's an example where a very similar style where they've collected information. This is on ontario.ca. Any PDF that you go to, the link doesn't actually take you to the direct PDF. It takes you to a PDF landing page that provides a bit of information about the PDF, when it was published, the page count, a link that gives you the file size, and then they have an accessible PDF viewer. And within that, you can access the document, it can go full screen, you can go into text. So if by chance they didn't have Acrobat installed, it still provides it for them. This is actually leveraging a product called Document Cloud, which is an open source tool, but does a lot of back-end analysis on text to find documents that are similar to each other. And it's completely transparent. You never know it's Document Cloud until you really dig into it. And it's typically used by news agencies. And they use it to, as they upload text to the Document Cloud system, it does text analysis to find common patterns between them. So typical file attributes that you'd want to add here are things like owners, date created, modified, what's the life cycle of the document. This may even be a moderation state or a workflow state that you could send it through. So as an example, this would be, how often does this file need to be reviewed? Is it once a year? Do you have a scheduled publication date of a file? Do you have files that need to be reviewed quarterly or monthly or weekly because it's just updated content, whatever it may be? And it may not even be PDFs. This could be images. It could be a video that has timely content. It's all dependent on what your needs are. But again, curate the process for them so you're not having to keep track of this in Excel files, in a separate Microsoft Access database, on a printed sheet of paper, on a Word document, on that Post-it note that's sitting up on your board forever. We want to put it as much as we can into the system without encroaching too far on the full document management system. Also, this is a great one to track as well. So typically, you have accessibility issues, but you may not be able to get things fully AA compliant right away for whatever reason. So it's good to track. We know for sure that things are A compliant versus AA compliant versus AAA compliant. And you can even broach that into, is it 508 compliant specifically, or some components of that 508 compliance. All right. So for video, here's an example, as I talked about before, where for both audio, descriptive video, closed captioning, transcripts, and even live streaming, when you upload an MP4, the system recognizes that it's an MP4, and we'll show a demo of this, an example, and you must provide a poster, and you must provide a caption file. And that ensures that it's accessible. Using the Web Experience Toolkit JS library, there's already the multimedia video components that are fully accessible and know how to read all of these files. So really, we just have to collect that information. Now, all of I talked about with this curated approach related to files is really encroaching on document management. And a lot of people would say, well, why don't we use SharePoint, or why don't we use Alfresco and use the CMIS module, whatever it may be, for full-blown document management. While there is some encroachment on document management, for the components that we've talked about, all of these fields, it's a typically expected feature of any content management system to be able to track this information. But media has always had a lack of features. We can have a round of applause for that one if you'd like.
I'm going to take a bow.
It's a common gripe, and it's usually from the business side. From a developer, they don't really notice the issue because they're not typically there on the business side that have to answer these business questions. It ends up saying, oh, I'm going to get a list of PDFs, and I'm going to track this separately, and the developers may never see it. Or if you're the developer, you may not know that the business side has these problems. So work together, talk to them about how can you enable the business process to make the system more efficient. And the Web Experience Toolkit distribution really looks at how can we make the efficiency of the system as high as possible while not making choices about how you work. So we give you the frame, but you still define your own content types. You still define how your own views work, but we give you all the tools. We give you all the modules that should work together, that have been tested, that are multilingual, that have the accessibility components, and allow you to leverage the JS library as much as possible. But we don't tell you how to use it. And that's really the value here. Another feature that we're working towards is a PDF accessibility checker that's built right into the media upload process. So this would be an automation that you would curate whenever possible. And this would be, as you upload the PDF, it runs through an accessibility check. So there's WCAG accessibility standards on PDFs that are already defined, and there are a set of rules that they go through exactly what needs to be checked. So we have a beta that's running. It's not in a Drupal module yet. It just runs as a Java applet to basically take in the content, process that PDF, and come back with the automated tests. Now, this doesn't mean that the PDF is 100% accessible, but it means that the standards are there. The same way that we use the Quail module and the accessibility module to do WCAG compliance on images and heading styles right within the body field, we should be able to leverage the same process as we go through a PDF. Obviously, one of the components here would be to allow a bypass. So if you wanted to, you could force the user to upload, but if you didn't want to, you could say no, as long as the PDF is, or only if the PDF is accessible, are you allowed to upload that document. And again, that's that curated approach about them not being able to upload bad content into the system. Forms is another common issue that we deal with. So first rule of thumb here, and the UK government has done an amazing job with this. So the UK government has a digital first design policy now, and you can find it if you do uk.gov digital policy. They have a full service design manual that's completely open source. Their first rule is digital first design. So any form, it must be made digital before it's made paper-based. So the first rule, or the second rule then, would be throw out that paper-based if it already exists and start from scratch. Because most times what we'll see is someone tries to recreate that exact paper form in the digital format. It doesn't apply that way. The digital way makes it different. And digital signatures is often a hot topic. Before you even get into a conversation, if you don't know the exact act and where your digital signature rules come from, do a quick Google search and likely you can find it in a few minutes. We've spent thousands and thousands of dollars having these discussions where everything was about hearsay and, oh, we've never done it this way before. Yet a quick Google search finds exactly what you need with the exact line that says, here's when you're allowed to do it, here's not when you're allowed to do it. You give it to the lawyer says, yeah, that's correct, and the conversations end. Otherwise, you can spend weeks and weeks talking about, is a digital signature allowed? Oh, we've never done it before. Oh, I don't think it's allowed, but no one actually ever looks it up. So also print style sheets are important, especially for forms where sometimes people do need to print. And this comes into play for something as simple as a body field or a long text field. You'll often see that, well, when you type and you're on a screen, you'll get the scroll bar within the body field. But if I want to print that form, I need to tell that field to fully expand, or else when I print, I don't see all the text that's hidden. So it's little things that you need to think about on how do I, if I needed to print that form for whatever reason, maybe part of the business process is I need to sign it physically. Well, it doesn't mean that you have to create a printable form in PDF. Create it in the HTML5 version, let them fill it out, and at the end of that process, hit print, which is your CSS print style sheet, and it will print out essentially the exact form that you need and everything is visible. Form validation is now important from an accessible standpoint of being able to know where the errors are. So obviously we have required fields. This is pulled directly from the Web Experience Toolkit JS library examples. So you'll see that they have titles, and they actually put required right within the title. And they'll use examples. So when a screen reader goes over this, if depending on how their configuration is set up, the screen reader could read it as star title if required wasn't there. Or if their screen reader was set up to recognize required fields, it might say star title required field. But you don't know that. You can't make that assumption. So little things like adding required allows you to know exactly what's going on. From a validation standpoint, here's where we look at where we have not just typically you'll see someone add the error message, or they'll say there's an error. Specifically say what the error is. So for in this example here, we have two errors. The first one that came up was this field is required. That's the base error. There was nothing there. But the second I typed 1, it's now please specify a valid phone number, because those are two different errors. The first one that the field was null, and the second error for that field was that it's not a valid format. At the top, it's not just there were errors on this page, and that's what typically what we see, or see below to find the errors. That may work great if there's like 3 fields, but what happens when there's like 60 fields? And I don't know if you've ever had this. I know I have. You scroll down and you're like, where's the error on the page? And you're scrolling up and down and trying to find it. Well, imagine if you're visually impaired. You can't see the form. How do you find where the errors are? And if it's 60 questions, do I have to go through every single question one at a time? Well, let's stay away from that. Instead, let's give them all the errors at the top, number them so they know how many errors they are, and some usability testing could even be done to do errors like 1 of 5, or 1 of 6, 2 of 6. So there's all sorts of little enhancements you could look at. But when I click on that link, it takes me directly to that error. Now there's even further enhancements where you can hide links behind the scenes to say, take me to the next error, or take me back up to the table of contents of error. So one of the first rules I always look at anytime I test accessibility is, can I navigate it with the keyboard? And once there's an error, how do I navigate around? And if I find them, click, 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 and you go all the way through, you hit this issue. Great example, yeah?
It's now 12:50. I'm starting one. I'm not saying you should stop, but I think you have a lot more material to go through.
Nope, just a little bit more.
Because I was going to suggest, there's a webinar.
Yeah, we can do a webinar, we can do BOF, whatever we need. So not that much more. So we'll jump on from there. So from an accessibility standpoint, the other big component here is not everything needs to be accessible. Just because you have a system doesn't mean that needs to be accessible. Find out what the function someone's trying to accomplish and make that accessible. So here's an example where you have, this is from the city of Ottawa, where they created in 2005, they had wards boundaries of the city that changed, and the councils and wards changed. So they said, use the EMAP program to type in your address, so it would load up this big bloated program that was full of GIS diagram or GIS systems, and you'd have to search your address and then click on the location and it would give you it. Well, the whole point of the function of this page was to provide what is my ward number, who's my counselor, and what is the new ward name. Well, then they said, well, let's give them also a PDF. Well, the PDF they gave them was literally like an architectural PDF that's all vectorized. And yeah, great, it'll zoom in, but it's pretty much useless if I can't navigate it. So instead, build something like an address lookup tool. So the Chicago actually did something very similar to this. They have their full-blown web apps, but then they provide a little tool like this. Type in your home address. Now, I'm not a fan of this format. There's much better ways to do the address recognition, but it proves the point. Where once we fill in the information, it returns exactly the whole point of the goal of this page. Who's my ward counselor? What's my ward number? And in this case, do I have residential parking zones for this address? And that's it. You've accomplished the goal. Another issue that you'll often run into is SEO versus accessibility. People in the SEO world, they often don't hear about accessibility, and they think that everything to do with the alt tags or the alt attributes and the title attributes are solely there to enhance your search results and make sure that your Google search rankings give you exactly, you're at the top. You want to be number 1 or 1 to 5 all the time. So really make sure that anyone that's doing SEO understands what accessibility is and where there's a balance in between. And you can have the whole comments about, I mean, is there a balance? Could you make something accessible, so using alt tags, or alt attributes and title attributes, but also keep your accessibility? There's going to be a balance. You're not going to be able to get 100% on both. Another one is try not to duplicate browser and OS functionality. So the second you duplicate this functionality, you're making assumptions about how their systems are configured or how they like to view things. The most popular example that I see is color contrast and font sizes. So you'll see a site that offers, click the 3 variations of font sizes, little a, medium A, and big A, or color contrast, and whatever those may be. You're making assumptions about how that user wants to view their content and what the best way is for them. If you ever look at your voiceover tools or any browser tools for accessibility, there's thousands of options for the exact configuration of how they should look for content. Bookmarking and printing are really popular examples as well. Bookmarking less and less as browsers have started to strip those away from the APIs, but printing is common, where you'll have the print button right on the page. Bookmarking was always a problem because you'd see those sites would take advantage of it, and you'd get those pop-ups way back in the day that say, oh, would you like to bookmark our site? And they'd add it to it. They don't so much do it anymore. But again, it comes back to this, don't duplicate basic functionality that is being provided. So things like even read aloud. You'll have those browse aloud apps that they'll try and embed right into the application. We want to stay away from that because the applications that people are using themselves are specifically tailored for what they need. So the last 3 slides that I want to show you are just some simple examples of how, well, alt text and title text may be simple. So in this example here, we have this simple image, yet it has very complex alt tags, but no title. If we jump to this example, it's the exact same image, but in this case, there's no alt text, but we have a caption of "Find your opportunity." In this case, we have 2 examples for the first image, where the first one is RCMP Musical Ride visits Quebec and Alberta this summer. Wow, I really got that from the image. That really helps me out. And, oh, RCMP Musical Rider on horseback. Again, I really got that from the image. And in this case, same image as before, I get Find Your Opportunity. My favorite is FIFA, where we have the FIFA image, and we have alt text of Canada is proud to host 2 major international women's soccer competitions. And the second version of this is, for the title text, we have Soccer Stadium with the acronym FIFA written across. That really helps me out. That's exactly what I wanted. And then the third variation that we have is no title text, but alt text of Soccer Stadium with the acronym FIFA written across. Again, in this case, we had alt text being used, versus the other one was title text. So little steps here. If you're doing multi-site deployments with same images, make sure you're providing alt text and title text for those images. Don't leave it up to the content editors to make the assumptions of what it's going to be. Because as we see in examples like this, people have different interpretations and different understandings of what that alt text and title text should be, even though they may have the exact same training. So, PDF accessibility automation checking. That's the next big one. File attributes as much as possible. Create a list of fields. make the curated approach, and remember that you don't always have to make the application or the function accessible. You may just be able to provide the alternate option that provides you the exact same goal. So the example I gave you was maps. Questions, comments? I'm happy to take anything afterwards. Yes? Yes. So they are accessible. They're very complicated to make accessible. And what we found is typically if we can stay away from them, do. They're very expensive to build. Especially, there's a balance too. Form PDFs that are savable, you have to pay a premium for, and form PDFs that are not savable but you can just print, but as soon as you close, they're often very cheap. We've had a few clients, they were paying $25,000 per form for savable PDFs. All right? And so imagine someone comes to you and goes, yeah, I want a form PDF, but that PDF maybe only be submitted for like 20 people. That's their market for that form. So you're going to pay $25,000 for 25 submissions. So business case, one really good example I have seen with fillable form PDFs are multi-stage PDFs, example like a passport document, that are likely not to be filled out all at the same time. If you have a My Account system and you're leveraging Drupal, you can do, example, as part of the Web Experience Toolkit, we leverage the web form, the latest version, and you can do savable draft formats. So if you're doing a My Account system, completely leverage the savable component. But if you do have to save, because it's multi-stage, you could do form PDFs. But as I said, it is complicated to make them accessible. That form cycle or the Adobe app life cycle, yeah, is very complicated to use. There's a lot, like you think training on web accessibility is complicated, train on that for accessibility, and it's very complicated. So I'd say it's like final option. The other example I have seen for it is where the document will become a QR code, so that when you bring in the printable version, they can get all of the information from the QR code directly into the system. And so the example there was there's no way to submit the form online, but when you bring the form in, someone doesn't want to retype it. So as they create the form, the QR code is generated, and then that QR code actually has all the form data. A QR code can hold a lot of information if it's something like this big. Now, you don't need to use PDFs for that. You can do a web version of that. But it's just a really great example. Other questions? Yeah?
So I missed the beginning. You probably covered this, but obviously the checking these fields and adding them to an image is built into the upload, whether you're using WYSIWYG or content.
Yes, as part of media. So if I was to go content, add content, and I was to do, content, files, add file, this component here, if I was to upload a PDF or a MP4 or an image, whatever it may be, because I'm using file entity, it recognizes the types of files that I'm using. And so based off of that, so if I see like edit file type, I can do it on the meme. So in this case, this is just for PDFs. And so media manager, so when you're embedding through the WYSIWYG, it uses the exact same interface, the exact same components.
And so obviously then it supports either CK editor or TinyMCE or something.
Yes. Yeah. The distribution uses CK editor for alignment with Drupal 8, but yeah, you could use TinyMCE as well. Yes.
You mentioned Alfresco would it be extremely complex to use Alfresco as a backend of this?
So if you were storing all your documents in Alfresco, you could use the CMIS module to pull them back and forth, and you could use so CMIS is the interoperability standard for content management systems, and there are Drupal modules for it. Alfresco is great at what it does, but for the most part, if you're just holding document attributes and you don't already have Alfresco, you might as well just keep your stuff in Drupal until you can come up with the real perfect use case for using Alfresco.
So you're multilingual and accessible and so forth. Those would probably be separate files.
In the Web Experience Toolkit case, and if you were to configure your instance of Drupal exactly the same way, all of the multilingual, all the attributes, everything is held solely in Drupal. So it's possible to do it all in Drupal. What I was saying was that Alfresco, if you did have all your content there, and that's where all your attributes were, you could still bring that content over into Drupal through the CMIS module. It's like a direct connection in real time. but you don't have to use Alfresco for a lot of the typical use cases that people think, oh, I have to go to Alfresco because I'm going to be keeping track of document accessibility, which is typically a field.
If you grab a lunch, you guys can actually grab a room downstairs and have a ball.
Any other questions before I shut it down? All right, thank you.